Good afternoon. Today we are talking about state governance. Hardly any of us are satisfied with the quality of state governance in our country. Meanwhile, many institutes graduate bachelors and masters in the speciality state and municipal governance. Two groups were those with a degree of master who had only a few months left until graduation, that is, when their education was actually finished, were asked to answer 12 test questions, and both of the groups failed the test. Although in fact their knowledge corresponds to the educational standards of the Russian Federation. Therefore, here are a few of the questions, tests, and a conversation. Why the test is precisely like this, and what stands behind it. Question 1. In some coordinate axes, schematically depict the graphs of the distribution functions of a random variable and the probability distribution density. Explain their interconnection in words or in the form of a mathematical formula. Question 2. How to correlate statistics presented in the tabular form with the representation of the same statistics in the form of distribution density. Question 3. What set of statistics, in your opinion, characterizes the life of the biospheric-social-economic system within the borders of the state? Question 4. Memoirs of which domestic and foreign politicians, scientists and technologists have you read up to this point? Question 5. Life is subordinated to objective laws. Indicate known to you examples of violations by state governance of pan-biospheric objective laws that characterize the life of ecosystems in the regions. Question 6. Offer a classification of objective laws that govern the life of society, i.e., combine them into groups according to one or another characteristic inherent in each group. Question 7. Indicate known to you examples of violations by state governance of objective biological laws that characterize the biological species Homo sapiens. Question 8. Build an enlarged scheme of money circulation in society. Question 9. How, in your opinion, will the functioning of the economy, the production-consumption system of society, differ in the following cases? First, acting in a system of the institution of lending with loan interest. Second, acting in the system of institution of interest-free lending. Question 10. Demonstrate your view on the principles of building the issuance policy of the state, i.e., on what principles should the issuance be carried out, in Russia in rubles, in other states in their legal currencies. Question 11. Give the most general, in your understanding, definition of the term governance applicable to all life situations. Question 12. What is the difference in processes of governance between control parameters and free parameters? This is the test. The first three questions, which concerned how the mathematical apparatus of probability theory and mathematical statistics correlates with real life, were not answered by a single person in the two groups. When asked who had read what memoirs, two people were able to name several books. One person said that he had read quite a lot, but he did not want to name everything in the test, because there was no need for it. And he, in the given question, was right. Nonetheless, the question still arises as to whether this test is adequate to the tasks of state governance, which are to be solved by graduates of the faculties of state and municipal governance of Russian institutes, or it is inadequate. And so let us move on, looking into the questions the way they are in the test. Of course, probability theory and mathematical statistics can be studied using serious higher educational textbooks, in which the mastery of the apparatus of differential and integral calculus is the basis for understanding all theorems, formulas, calculations. Is it necessary? Yes, in some cases it's necessary. But in most cases, in fact, one must understand one simple thing, that the distribution of a random variable is a non-decreasing function that takes a value from 0 to 1. To 0 corresponds the value of the argument, that is, of a random variable below which there is no single element of a countable or uncountable plurality, which is described by the statistics. To 1 corresponds that value of the argument when the whole statistics falls within the interval on which the distribution function of the random variable is determined. The density of the probability distribution is the first derivative of the distribution of a random variable. Accordingly, if we integrate the probability density, then we get the distribution function of a random variable. Such are the interconnections between the mathematical formulas of both functions. What else is good to know? Well, since the probability distribution density is the derivatives of the distribution of a random variable, then, if on some intervals of the argument or at some points of the argument, the distribution of a random variable is not differentiable, then at these points, on these intervals, the density of the probability distribution does not exist. In other words, the distribution of a random variable always exists, and the density of the probability distribution exists only under certain specified conditions. Question 2. How to correlate statistics presented in a tabular form with the representation of the same statistics in the form of a distribution density. When we consider statistics in a tabular form, we usually have in the table heading, in the line of the table heading, in each column, a certain range, which contains a certain part of the plurality we are considering, and which we want to describe with statistics. Accordingly, in the line where the statistics itself is presented, below the heading line, in each cell, the part of the plurality is presented, the plurality that fell into this range of statistics. That is, statistics in such a tabular form represent some approximation of the density of probability distribution. Well, in what sense, some approximation? The density of the probability distribution as an analytical function, ideally, is defined at each point of the abscissa axis, the axis of the argument. When we consider the tabular form of statistics, then a certain interval corresponds to each column of the table. Accordingly, we have the part of statistics falling on these intervals. But if we draw the probability distribution density as an approximation, we will also get an analytical function that approximately describes the statistics we have from a certain system, from a certain object, from a certain plurality, and presented in a tabular form. Accordingly, if we carry out the adding of the content of the table cells sequentially, then each addition operation gives us the value of the distribution of the random variable to the right edge, to the right border of the interval, up to the final value of the corresponding column in the table. Thus, when we have a sum of all the columns of the table, we will receive the full distribution of the random variable, which we characterize as statistics. In other words, in essence, there were no difficult questions in this form. In the form of perception of the tables and graphs, statistics, and understanding of the essence of what is described by probability theory and mathematical statistics is available to school children who wield 4 actions of arithmetic. They can understand that if there is a plurality of things, in a certain sense homogeneous, then the distribution, according to the parameters of this homogeneity of things, can be written in a tabular or graphical form like this. That is, there was nothing complicated and abstruse in these 2 questions. What is useful to know? By that time, those with the degrees of masters had passed, as a minimum, tests, and as a maximum had received scores in the course Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics. Question 3. What set of statistics, in your opinion, characterizes the life of the biospheric-social-economic system within the borders of the state? If we are going to govern or organize self-governance of this very biospheric social-economic system within the boundaries of the state, then we have to have metrologically consistent views on the vector of objectives and governance, on the vector of current state. But since the biospheric social-economic system within the borders of the state is a mutually nested supersystem, that is, a certain plurality of elements, then governance cannot be built on such a terminological apparatus as we have many beautiful flowers in the meadow, there are many lakes in our land, many people live in our city and they go to work, where they produce many different products. Governance in such questions requires concretics. If we are dealing with a plurality, then the plurality is described by statistics. If every element of the plurality is described by a certain set of characteristic parameters, and the set of characteristic parameters is the same for all elements of this plurality, then such a plurality is described by a certain set of statistics characterizing every one of the elements with which we determine the belonging to the plurality. And accordingly, even if we do not want to govern the state, and we are simply interested in the quality of life, then there arises the question on the set of statistics that describes the biosphere in the regions of the state, as well as on the set of statistics that describes the population of the state, on the set of statistics that describes the economy of the state. Well, for many, economy is just an abstract word. But in life, it is a production of products and extraction of natural resources, and the provision of consumers with the opportunity to use the products and natural resources. Therefore, the first two questions of the test are essentially the fundamental basis in order to speak concretely about state governance, and to speak about state governance in the concretics of these or those political situations. Well, let's take a look at our life. Now we have the 7th convocation of the State Duma. If our deputies are really blago-intentioned, if they are governorially literate, and every one of them, being a professional in his own sphere, is able to describe it with statistics, then logically, within at least the past 10 years, if not more, there should be a normative, a juridically obliging state act, on the list of statistics that characterizes the biospheric-social-economic systems in each region of the country which has this or that peculiarity that allows demarking the regions. Well, after the list of statistics has been determined, the question arises concerning the correlation of statistics of different years and regions with each other. This means that this State Act, in addition to the list of statistics, must contain a description of metrologically consistent procedures that enables one to form each of the statistics of the list. What is meant by metrologically consistent procedures in the given case? This is primarily a question about the principles of constructing a characteristic selection for the formation of each of these statistics. Because if you analyze the whole plurality, then you will waste a lot of time, and you will need a lot of resources in order to collect these statistics. And by the time of completion of the work on the formation of statistics, you will probably have spent so much time that the statistics will no longer be governorially relevant. That is, it will probably be of some retrospective interest for analyzing the causes for the arisal of the current state, but not of the basis for forming state governance for the foreseeable future. If you correctly form a representative selection, then you can already analyze not a whole plurality, but some part of it. But the statistical characteristics of the representative selection, that is, the distribution of a random variable, the probability distribution density if it exists, they will be, with an accuracy acceptable for practice, identical to the statistical characteristics of the whole plurality. Accordingly, if we are talking about working out of a political course for the future, then the future quality of life of society also has to be described by some statistics. And modern technology enables one to display all statistics not only in a tabular form, but also in the form of graphs and the dynamics of processes. That is, the change in statistics can also be displayed in the form of graphs, going up and down the display of a monitor screen, or the display in a hall, with people discussing the problematics of the development of the country. But if the statistics change, and each of these statistics characterizes some aspect of the life of society, then accordingly another question arises. Here we have the following form of the distribution of the random variable. That is, there is a certain minimum value, there is a certain maximum value. Between them there is a certain graph of a non-decreasing function with values from 0 to 1, or if you like from 0% to 100%, which contains the whole statistics, the whole plurality. This is a given at a certain point in time, or a given that characterizes a certain time interval, since, after all, collecting statistics requires some time, and not all types of statistics can be characterized as instantaneous statistics, attributed to a certain moment in time. But if society changes in some way, then there are two variants. Either it degrades, or it develops in relation to the characteristic parameter presented in these statistics. If we consider a certain plurality of statistics, then there may be such variance that according to some statistics we are developing, and according to others we are degrading. In addition, statistics can be interconnected. That is, if we see development in one statistics, then by virtue of the interconnections of statistics, conditioned by the objective laws of the life of society, which is spoken of in the following questions, changes in one statistics will be accompanied by some changes in other connected with it statistics. In this case, it is possible to reduce the number of statistics, the number of collections, the quantity of statistics that are regularly applied by taking information from the biospheric-social-economic system, and at some time intervals, connected statistics can be approximately evaluated by mathematical methods. Well, if we are absolutely strict to the question, then it is like this. If society changes, then politics has to be aimed at the development of society but not at the degradation, and accordingly the question about the criteria for the evaluation of changes in statistics arises. That is, if we have at the initial moment of time one graph of the distribution of the random variable, and after some time this graph changes its shape, that is, 0 shifts to the right or left, the maximum also shifts to the right or left, then when governing based on a statistical analysis, the question about the criteria inevitably arises. Are these changes in this very statistics good or bad? If it is good, then it's good. And if it's bad, the question arises, what should be done to make it good? Well, you yourselves understand, since during the entire period of its existence the State Duma has not condescended to determine a set of statistics and standard procedures for collecting and analyzing statistical information, then there is no point in talking about professionally consistent state governance in Russia. One of the reasons for this is that among the deputies we have singers, athletes, and many other people who, even if they have diplomas in law or diplomas on state and municipal governance, do not know a thing if they are asked the concrete question, what is the graph of the distribution of a random variable? What is the probability density, and how does this correlate with our life, everyone's life? Our deputies cannot correlate this with the sphere of their previous professional activity, because singing, sports in a normal society is leisure, but not work. In a not normal society, these are branches of show business. But these are also sectors that do not directly affect the quality of life of society, unlike such industries as agriculture, manufacturing, other types of industries, science, the system of education. Question 4. Memoirs of which domestic and foreign politicians, scientists, and technologists have you read up to this point? Well, the question is, what relation, for example, do the memoirs of Admiral Chichagov, a military and political leader of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, have with the present days? What relation do the memoirs of Kornei Chukovsky have with the present days? However, they have a relation, because in the present we sometimes deal with processes that began not only a few decades ago, but also several centuries ago. There is such a peculiarity. Our historical science, not as a collection of texts, but as a collection of people who are engaged in the study of history, these are in most cases governarially illiterate people. By force of their governarial illiteracy, they, even knowing a lot of facts, reliable facts, not fictional ones about the events of the past, do not, behind all this plurality of facts, see processes that are characterized by these or those statistics, or some characteristic features without statistics. And they do not see the processes of governance, both as the flow of these processes and by the mutual impact of these processes on each other. If we study history only from textbooks and monographs, then we have views mainly about the chronological skeleton of history. But the flesh and the spirit of history is given to us by the memoirs of participants, witnesses and contemporaries of those events, as well as literature written by contemporaries of those events or direct descendants who communicated with the contemporaries and participants of those events. To put it differently, in order to have a clear view on what happened in the Patriotic War of 1812, War and Peace by L. Tolstoy is not enough. But textbooks on history and special monographs on the War of 1812 to 1814, without Tolstoy's War and Peace, this is an incomplete view on what was in that era. Therefore, the question on memoirs, memoirs of domestic and foreign political figures, scientists and technologists, is not divorced from life, and is not divorced from the question of state governance. Here is one of the examples, one of the mysteries of history. We have a view on the era of Nikolai I based on what liberal historians have written. And in this view, Nikolai I appears as a despot, a superior tyrant, a bullhead, a rude and uncultured man from the military to whom it was impossible to explain anything and who led Russia to defeat in the Crimean War. Along with this, historians tell us that there was such an outstanding figure in the Russian Navy, Admiral Mikhail Petrovich Lazarev. Mikhail Petrovich Lazarev was a member of the first Russian Antarctic expedition where he commanded the ship the Mirny, and Admiral Thady Bellinghausen commanded the ship Vostok. So all historians of the liberal views, when they talk about the first Russian Antarctic expedition, for some reason keep silent about the fact that the expedition stopped its activity not because it had fulfilled its scientific program, but for the reason that the Vostok, which was built from damp pine wood, had such a leak during the polar storms that there was a threat of the perishing of the ship, and the Vostok, under full sail from Antarctica, went to Rio de Janeiro, and the team worked around the clock pumping out water. The second ship, the Mirny, was well built. In those days, a leak was a natural phenomenon for a wooden ship, due to design and technology. It is impossible to build a structure out of a set of wooden elements that will be as waterproof as a bottle. And the leak, about 2.5 inches a day in calm waters, was inherent in the Mirny. 2.5 inches a day. This means that there was approximately a 7 centimeter layer of water on its bottom in calm waters. Lazarev, in his memoirs about the expedition, noted that even in strong storms with an irregular and regular wave, the leak on the Mirny did not increase, and still amounted to about 2.5 inches per day. You just imagine how terribly the Vostok was built in comparison with the Mirny. And the Mirny arrived in Rio de Janeiro alone, a week or so after the Vostok had arrived. After the Vostok was repaired in Rio de Janeiro, only after that, the expedition was able to return to Russia. The French Marquis de Traversay was responsible for the composition of the expedition. What happened then? Then Lazarev continued to serve in the navy. He participated in the Battle of Navarino as the commander of the battleship Azov. When the expedition of the Baltic Sea Squadron to the Mediterranean Sea was over, the ships returned to the Baltic. And it happened that the ship Champenoise, named after one of the victories of the Russian army in the War of 1812, burned down at the entrance of Kronstadt. About 50 people died, but the fact was that it was a squadron's treasury ship. Along with the ship, a certain amount of money and all accounting records of the entire duration of the voyages of the expedition burned. The sovereign Tsar Nikolai Pavlovich was on the throne. Nikolai Pavlovich suspected arson and ordered Lazarev to investigate this disaster. Lazarev investigated and reported to the Tsar that there was no arson. The ship burned down as a result of an unfortunate convergence of circumstances, due to the fact that the crew was tired from the long journey, and by the time they returned to Kronstadt, the crew was already in an idling state. Nikolai did not believe it and ordered Lazarev to reinvestigate the cause of the death of the Champenoise. Lazarev reinvestigated and reported to the Tsar again that there was no arson. The case was closed, and after that Nikolai I trusted Lazarev. Liberal historians note that after Lazarev headed the Black Sea Fleet in 1833, the Black Sea Fleet was the only island of freedom in the Russian Empire. There was no drill, the officers allowed themselves to walk with their uniforms unbuttoned, and when one complained to Nikolai I about this, he simply answered, "Leave Lazarev alone, he knows what he's doing." In his turn, Mikhail Petrovich Lazarev characterized Nikolai I as a benefactor. You see, these relationships do not fit into the picture that the liberal historians draw for us. Why did Nikolai allow Lazarev to do what he did not allow others to do? Why did he answer all complaints about Lazarev saying, "Leave him alone, he knows what he's doing"? Why did Lazarev, who was far from being an idiot, he was the second real builder of the Russian fleet after Peter the Great, have the deepest respect for Nikolai I and call him a benefactor? The answer to this question is simple. Lazarev was really not an idiot. Lazarev was one of the outstanding professionals, military seamen of that era, and besides that, Lazarev was not servile. He was not a flatterer. Nikolai I respected him for his honesty, stamina of character, because he did not bend under the suspicion of the emperor. He didn't make it look like the death of the treasury ship was an arson in order to conceal corruption and stealing. So the combination of these three qualities, honesty, stamina in any conditions, and the highest professionalism, determined the relationship between Nikolai I and Lazarev. But those who were servile to the emperor, and were professionally inconsistent, they, for the most part, described in their memoirs Nikolai I as a despot, a tyrant, a bullhead who did not understand what he was doing. And the trouble of the era of Nikolai was not at all in the fact that he was an ill-bred soldier, a despot, a tyrant, but the trouble was in the fact that he had a severe deficiency of professionally consistent cadres who could be trusted. After all, it is not without reason that the following phrase, said by him to the heir of the throne, arose. It seems that in Russia, only you and I do not steal. Therefore, many things that took place in the past, in some cases continuing to exert their impact on the present, are inaccessible to us if we rely only on history textbooks and monographs written by professional historians. Many things become clear to us only when we turn to the memoirs of contemporaries, participants, and eyewitnesses of the events. One wrote about one thing, another wrote about another thing, a third about something else. If this correlates with each other, then you can see mutually supplementary evidence. And you see not only a chronological skeleton of history, but also the spirit of the era, the psychodynamics of the era, which conditioned the course of events in this way, but not otherwise, and conditioned certain tendencies that have been realized and have become reality and contemporary activity. Therefore, the question of memoirs is really not empty, and unfortunately new generations in our country, apart from SMS messages, read little. Question 5. Life is subordinated to objective laws. Indicate known to you examples of violations by the state governance of pan-biospheric objective laws that characterize the life of ecosystems in the regions. Several people named Lake Baikal's ecological problems as a consequence of the inadequate industrial development of the region. The majority did not answer the question. Question 6. Offer a classification of objective laws that govern the life of society, i.e., combine them into groups according to one or another characteristic inherent in each group. There were no answers to this question either, although the previous question is essentially a hint that there are pan-biospheric objective laws. This is one of the groups, and accordingly if one thinks about it, scratches the back of the head, recalls what one was taught at school, at university, then one can squeeze some classification out of oneself. The question is not whether it corresponds to the classification that the teacher adheres to. The question is, either those students were at the lecture in a state of relaxation, like in a movie theater, or at some kind of show, or they finished their graduate master's course but never learned to think. Further on, they come to state governance not knowing how to think and not having a world outlook. Well, can you guess where they will steer? Question 7. Indicate known to you examples of violations by the state governance of objective biological laws that characterize the biological species Homo sapiens. Recall the discussions in recent decades on the theme of the purpose consonants of setting the clock forward and backward in summer and winter time. If we are a biological species and part of the biosphere, then the entire biosphere lives according to the sun, according to the daily and annual solar rhythms, plus the lunar rhythms, which also have their impact on daily cyclics, on the monthly cyclics during the year, in particular low-high tides. The phases of the moon, its remoteness, impact many processes of a biological character. Allegedly, it makes sense to switch to summer and winter time in order to save electricity for lighting. You see, the era when the bulk of the generated electricity was for lighting ended a long time ago. The work of industrial enterprises, transport infrastructures, is the main volume of electricity consumption in modern conditions, and regardless of whether a locomotive pulls rail wagons at night or daytime, the energy consumption in this case is actually the same, because the headlights and projectors of the electric locomotive are not the main consumers of electricity. But if the biorhythmics of the human organism is connected with the daily rhythmics, and we break it twice a year, and the adaptational period to the new rhythmics of life is a minimum of 2 weeks, but there are, however, people with very rigid biorhythms who are ready to kill everyone who offers to set the clock an hour forward or backward, and they have the moral right to do so, because from their point of view, this is a necessary defense, a protection of their health. Losses from violated biorhythmics in the form of a decrease in labor productivity, both under the impact of the organism itself and under the impact of violation of communication of people in the collective, economic losses connected with the surge in morbidity, conditioned by the changing in rhythmics every 2 years. Has anyone ever evaluated them? Has anyone ever realized that these things exist, and that they worsen the quality of life of many millions of people? This is an example of a violation of biological objective laws by the state governance. The second example is the conception of megalopolis urbanization. The entire population should be pulled together in 10 large megalopolises and agglomerations around them. Those who started this, there are no kind words in their address for the simple reason that pulling a person out of the biosphere, they doom new generations to biological degradation, which will be followed by socio-cultural degradation. In other words, megalopolis urbanization, liquidation of settlements and villages as economically unprofitable places, concentration of the population in megalopolises and their suburbs, this is a program of biological genocide of the population of Russia. E. Nabulina is now the head of the central bank. When she was the head of the Ministry of Economic Development, she presented this program at the Moscow Urban Forum. This is an example of the fact that a person with a purely financial accounting education should not go beyond the accounting department in their activities. Nevertheless, the politics concerning cadres is like this. Question 8. Build an enlarged scheme of money circulation. Nobody built it. In the old days, people like Nabulina and others, when they were at school, had the section electricity in the course of physics. During the course, in the Soviet school, teachers talked about Kirchhoff's rules. Kirchhoff's rules are a modeling of transfer of processes in networks, that is, how much of what from point A flows into points B, C, and others, from which point A is connected through the network. In order to build a scheme of monetary circulation based on Kirchhoff's rules, it takes about 5 minutes. There is an issuance center from where money flows. There is a financial sector where there is money and a certain internal circulation. There are those who extract raw materials and energy carriers. There are those who process raw materials and energy carriers. Those who process raw materials to those who extract in one direction and receive money for it. And on the other hand, processors sell finished products to the end consumers. This is society itself and its state apparatus. And for this they also receive money. In fact, even from the words, it is clear that this is simple. So one can build a scheme of money circulation like this. In this system, there is always 100% of money, and this 100% is only expressed in certain nominal amounts. If one analyzes money circulation in this system, if there is the institution of lending with loan interest, and the actions in the same system of the institution of interest-free lending, then one will see that the loan interest is the primary generator of inflation. And accordingly, if the Central Bank of Russia was really concerned about inflation, then it would not have this empty chatter about the fact that inflation is high, and it does not allow lowering the loan rate, but it would reduce the loan rate to 0. And a long time ago, the central bank would have stated that the country needs a system of interest-free lending, and its financial experts would have suggested the way to implement a system of interest-free lending so that the banking sector and the real sector and the population could live better year after year, being confident in tomorrow. So all conversations on the theme, well, we tried and tried, and the global financial economic crisis of 2008, 10 years ago, is already gone, and the sanctions imposed after the reunification of Crimea with Russia had an impact on us. These are all excuses, because the only problem of Russia in the aspect of the economy is state governance which is inadequate to the tasks of development. Governance that is based on the total professional inconsistency and blatant ignorance of state officials. Both those in power, on whose signatures and words the making of certain governorial decisions depends, and those who work out these governorial decisions, that is, on those from the state apparatus. Also, the deputy corps at all levels in our country is ignorant concerning the content of all objective laws to which the life of human society is subordinated, and concerning how to build state governance in such a way that these objective laws work for politics rather than destroy the blago intentions aimed at improving the quality of life of society. Question 10. Demonstrate your views on the principles of building the issuance policy of the state. This question implies the fact that the volume of production in all industries is primarily conditioned by the energy supply capacity of these sectors, and secondly by the energy conversion efficiency of the usage of energy, in which the following is expressed: the perfection of technologies, the perfection of designs, the perfection of logistic and other organizational procedures. And therefore, the issuance must be consistent with the law of conservation of energy, to which everything in nature is subordinated, including all technological, logistic processes in the economy. If you overcritically violate in any direction this proportion, the volume of energy supply capacity of the economy, the amount of money in circulation, then you thereby destroy all economic connections, or stifle the economy with absence of money, while prices constantly rise under the influence of loan interest. This is what our central bank has been doing quite legally throughout the existence of the 1993 Constitution. And note that the central bank is not juridically responsible for anything in our country, because its only constitutional duty is to ensure the stability of the ruble. But what is the stability of the ruble? This term is juridically undetermined, and among the classical economists, this question is debatable. Question 11. Give the most general, in your understanding, definition of the term governance, applicable to all life situations. We use the sufficiently general theory of governance, in which there is such a concept as the entire function of governance. You see, the question is not about words. The question is that if a person sees the entire function of governance, the beginning of which helps him to detect factors of the environment which puts pressure on the psyche and causes the need for governance, and which ends with the achievement of objectives in relation to this factor, then this person is able to describe the entire function of governance in some words. And then he will get a certain definition of the term governance, in the most general sense, applicable to all life situations. Question 12. What is the difference in processes of governance between control parameters and free parameters? The difference actually should be clear. Control parameters are included in the vector of objectives, and free parameters are those parameters any values of which are recognized as acceptable in the process of governance. So, this test of 12 questions, if it does the rounds, the overwhelming majority of civil servants, the overwhelming majority of deputies of all levels, will not pass. This means that Russia is experiencing very severe problems caused by the ignorance, feeble-mindedness, and grabbing of the governorial corps, who have incomes manifoldly higher than the incomes of those who actually work in different sectors of the economy. This is a simple test, and not very complicated comments on it. For those to whom little has been said, there is literature. You can read the book Economics of Innovation or Development. There you can find a little on everything.